There is a river that has never stopped flowing. For 10,000 years, it has carved its path through lowest yellow earth, flooding without warning, retreating without apology, and demanding from every generation that lived along its banks something extraordinary: cooperation, ingenuity, and an almost stubborn refusal to disappear. That river is the Yellow River, and the civilization it forged is unlike anything else the human story has ever produced. Consider this for a moment. While Rome was still a collection of mud huts on 7 hills, Chinese philosophers were already debating the nature of virtue, governance, and the cosmos. While medieval Europe struggled to produce a single printed page, Chinese workshops were already printing books, manufacturing paper currency, and engineering explosive weapons. And when the last emperor of China finally abdicated in 1912, a 6-year-old child named Puyi, sitting alone in the Forbidden City. He was ending an unbroken tradition of imperial rule stretching back 2,132 years. No other civilization on Earth has held that conversation with itself for so long without falling permanently silent. This is the complete story of China, not a fragment, not a highlight reel, the full arc, from the very first Neolithic farmers who pressed painted symbols into wet clay along the Yellow River around 7,000 years before the Common Era, all the way to the moment that ancient world dissolved into the modern one. We will walk through every dynasty, every turning point, every catastrophe and renaissance that shaped this civilization into what it became. We will stand inside the oracle bone workshops of the Shang Dynasty, where priests scorch turtle shells to hear the voices of ancestors. We will follow Qin Shi Huang as he burns books, buries scholars, and builds an army of 8,000 terracotta warriors to guard him in death. We will move through the golden streets of Chang'an, a city of 1 million souls, the largest on Earth in the 7th century, where Persian merchants, Japanese students, and Indian monks traded alongside Chinese poets composing verses that school children still recite today. We will sail with Admiral Zheng, his treasure fleets across the Indian Ocean on vessels 4 times the size of Columbus's ships. And we will witness the slow unraveling of the Qing Dynasty under the weight of opium wars, rebellion, and the relentless pressure of a world that had changed faster than any emperor could manage. Along the way, we will touch the materials this civilization left behind: carved jade bai discs, polished bronze ritual cauldrons, glazed porcelain fired to translucent perfection, silk so fine it sold in Rome for its weight in gold, rammed earth palace walls still standing after 3,000 years. These are not museum objects. They are evidence of a living world, and we will place them back inside it. What makes China's story so extraordinary is not merely its length. It is the pattern embedded within it. The dynastic cycle of rise, achievement, corruption, collapse, and reconstruction, repeated so consistently across 4,000 years that Chinese historians gave it a name. Every dynasty carried within it the seeds of its own dissolution. And yet, after every collapse, China rebuilt. That resilience, that continuity, is the deepest mystery this series will explore. If you find yourself drawn to these complete journeys through the ancient world, the full stories, told with the detail and depth they deserve, please subscribe so you never miss our next exploration. Each week, we bring you the whole story of a civilization that changed the world. Now, let us begin our journey at the edge of the Yellow River, in the earliest light of human memory, where the first fires were lit and the first symbols were drawn, and where everything that followed was quietly set in motion. Before there were emperors, before there were armies or bronze or written law, there was the river. The Yellow River moves through the Loess Plateau of northern China with a weight that feels almost deliberate, carrying so much suspended sediment that its waters run the color of pale clay, staining everything it touches. For thousands of years before any dynasty gave this land a name, the river flooded and retreated, depositing the fine yellow soil that would become the foundation of a civilization. The land it shaped was not gentle. It demanded attention, collective labor, and an intimate understanding of seasonal rhythms. It rewarded those who learned to read it. Around 7000 BCE, in what is now Henan province, a community settled along the banks of a tributary stream at a place archaeologists would one day call Jiahu. These were not wanderers. They cultivated millet in carefully tended plots, kept domesticated pigs, and stored fermented beverages made from rice, honey, and hawthorn fruit. Among the earliest evidence of intentional fermentation anywhere on Earth. But what makes Jiahu extraordinary is something smaller and more haunting. Bone flutes, carved from the hollow wing bones of red-crowned cranes, pierced with precisely spaced holes. Dated to 7000 BCE, they are among the oldest playable musical instruments ever discovered. Someone at Jiahu understood not only survival, but beauty. These early communities left behind something else, incised symbols scratched onto tortoise shells and bone. Whether these marks constituted proto-writing or ritual notation remains debated, but their presence suggests minds already reaching toward abstraction, toward the impulse to record and transmit meaning across time. By 5000 BCE, a broader cultural tradition had spread across the Yellow River Basin. The Yangshao people painted their pottery with bold geometric patterns, spirals, fish, human faces, rendered in deep red and black pigment on burnished clay surfaces. These vessels were not merely functional. Their decoration followed consistent visual grammars, suggesting shared aesthetic values across communities separated by hundreds of kilometers. The Yangshao did not build in stone. Their villages rose from rammed earth and timber, arranged around central open spaces, surrounded by ditches that marked the boundary between the human world and the wild. Further east, and later, the Longshan culture refined everything. By 3000 BCE, Longshan potters were producing eggshell-thin black ceramics of extraordinary technical precision. Vessels so delicate that their walls measured less than a millimeter in thickness. Longshan settlements grew larger and more defended, surrounded by stamped earth walls. Social hierarchies deepened. Burial sites reveal growing distinctions between the richly interred and the simply placed. The first visible archaeology of inequality. To the south, along the lower Yangtze River Delta, the Liangzhu culture developed in parallel, and in some ways surpassed its northern contemporaries in one specific domain, jade. Between 3300 and 2300 BCE, Liangzhu craftsmen shaped jade into bai discs, flat circular forms with central holes, and Kong tubes, square-section cylinders with circular bores, carved with repeated mask-like faces of extraordinary refinement. These objects required tools harder than jade itself to produce, and their consistent iconography across a wide geographic area suggests a shared ceremonial system, perhaps a priestly class, perhaps a cosmology in which jade mediated between earth and heaven. By 2500 BCE, the landscape of what would become China held dozens of regional cultures, each developing independently yet connected by trade, migration, and the slow diffusion of ideas. Millet cultivation dominated the north. Rice cultivation anchored the south. Silk production had begun. The earliest silk fibers yet discovered date to around 3600 BCE in Henan province. Then, from the accumulated weight of these millennia, legend and archaeology converge. Ancient Chinese texts speak of the Yellow Emperor, Huangdi, a culture hero credited with teaching humanity to build houses, domesticate animals, and cultivate grain. His consort, Laozi, is said to have discovered silk when a cocoon fell into her tea. These are myths, but they are myths that encode real transitions, the shift from foraging to farming, from wandering to settlement, from survival to civilization. The Chinese tradition did not invent these stories carelessly. It used them to name the moment when scattered hearths became something larger, something continuous, something that would endure for 10,000 years and more. The river kept flowing, the soil kept accumulating, and in the silence before dynasties, a civilization was already learning its own name. The floods came without warning. Across the Yellow River Basin, where Laos yellow plains stretched toward distant mountains, the river swelled and broke its banks with a violence that erased villages, drowned harvests, and scattered communities across the floodplain. For generations, the people of the Central Plains had lived at the mercy of these waters, building, losing, rebuilding. It was this relentless cycle of destruction and reconstruction that forced something new into existence. Not merely survival, but organization. Not merely labor, but authority. Ancient Chinese texts, the Shujing, the Shiji, name the man who changed this equation, Yu the Great. According to tradition, Yu spent 13 years engineering a solution to the floods, not by building walls against the water, but by channeling it, dredging rivers, cutting drainage channels, redirecting flow toward the sea. The texts record that he passed his own home 3 times during those years without entering. So consumed was he by the work. Whether Yu was a single historical figure or a composite memory of generations of hydraulic engineers, the tradition encodes a profound truth. The administrative state was born from the necessity of coordinating mass labor against natural catastrophe. Someone had to organize the workers. Someone had to allocate the grain. Someone had to be obeyed. Around 2100 BCE, that someone became a king. Yu founded the Xia Dynasty, China's first, and when he died, power passed not to a chosen successor, but to his son. Hereditary kingship had arrived. The shift was seismic. For millennia, leadership among the communities of the Yellow River Basin had operated through consensus, through the selection of capable men by tribal elders. Now, a single bloodline claimed permanent authority. The mandate of heaven, the idea that rulers governed with cosmic sanction, had not yet been formally articulated, but its logic was already present in the Xia claim. The man who controlled the waters controlled the world. The archaeological site of Erlitou in Henan province sits quietly in the agricultural flatlands near the Yi and Luo rivers. Excavations begun in 1959 have revealed a settlement covering 300 hectares, a planned urban complex of a scale unprecedented in the region. At its center stand the foundations of palatial compounds, rammed earth platforms supporting timber-framed halls enclosed within courtyard walls, oriented with deliberate precision along cardinal axes. These are not the remains of a village. They are the bones of a capital. Within Erlitou's workshops, archaeologists have uncovered the earliest evidence of large-scale bronze casting in China. The objects produced here were not tools or weapons. They were ritual vessels. Bronze Ju, 3-legged wine pourers with elegant upswept spouts, appear in elite burials alongside turquoise inlaid artifacts of extraordinary refinement. One object in particular commands attention: a coiled dragon figure assembled from more than 2,000 individual turquoise pieces, each no larger than a fingernail, fitted together with a precision that speaks of specialized craftsmen working under centralized direction. Turquoise came from distant sources. Its presence at Erlitou signals trade networks, surplus wealth, and the kind of administrative coordination that only a state can sustain. Jade, however, remained the supreme material of power. From the Liangzhu culture's Bai discs and Kong tubes, inherited and reinterpreted by Xia-era elites, jade carried meanings that bronze could not yet claim. Its hardness suggested permanence. Its translucent green depths suggested the boundary between the human and the cosmic. To hold jade was to hold authority that transcended the merely political. Xia kings were buried with jade. Their rituals employed jade. The material language of kingship was written in stone that took months to carve and lifetimes to accumulate. Erlitou's occupation spans roughly 1900 to 1500 BCE, a period that overlaps with the later Jia and the early Shang chronologies. The site does not announce itself as Jia with inscriptions or royal proclamations. The writing that would make such declarations possible had not yet fully emerged, but the evidence speaks in its own language. The planned city, the bronze workshops, the palatial foundations, the elite burials rich with jade and turquoise. Something that deserves the name of dynasty had taken root in the Central Plains. The river had been answered. The king had been crowned. And the long conversation between power and civilization in China had spoken its first clear words. The bones do not look like history at first. They are small, yellowed, cracked along deliberate lines, turtle plastrons and ox shoulder blades, smooth on one surface and rough on the other. But press close, and the surface reveals itself. Rows of incised marks, precise and purposeful, cut into the bone with bronze tools by hands that understood exactly what they were doing. These are oracle bones, and they are the moment China steps from the archaeological record into the written one. At Anyang in Henan province, beneath fields that farmers worked for centuries without knowing what lay beneath, archaeologists beginning in the 1920s uncovered the remains of Yin, the last and greatest capital of the Shang Dynasty. The city flourished from roughly 1250 BCE until the dynasty's fall in 1046 BCE, and its buried layers preserve a civilization of startling sophistication. Yin was not a village that grew into a city. It was a planned capital organized around royal authority, ritual practice, and the management of bronze on a scale the ancient world had rarely attempted. The Shang Dynasty itself begins around 1600 BCE, when, according to later tradition, a ruler named Tang overthrew the last Xia king and established a new royal line. The early Shang moved their capital multiple times, a pattern that may reflect floods, political instability, or ritual requirements. But by the time Yin was established, the dynasty had found its permanent center. The city covered several square kilometers. Its population by 1200 BCE may have reached 100,000 people: craftsmen, priests, soldiers, farmers, and the royal household itself, all organized within a hierarchy that placed the king at the intersection of the human and divine. Shang kingship was theocratic in the most literal sense. The king did not merely rule, he communicated with ancestors and spirits on behalf of the living. Every significant decision, from military campaigns to harvests to the timing of rituals, was submitted to divination. A diviner would inscribe a question onto a turtle shell or ox scapula, apply heat to a prepared hollow and the reverse, and read the resulting cracks as the ancestor's response. The question and its answer were then inscribed onto the bone itself. Over 150,000 of these inscribed pieces survive, a bureaucratic archive of royal anxiety, preserved in the earth for 3,000 years. The bronze that emerges from Shang workshops is among the most technically demanding metalwork the ancient world produced. The casting process required clay molds assembled in sections, precise temperature control, and an understanding of alloy composition, copper, tin, and lead, combined in ratios that varied by vessel type. The results are monumental. The Humuwu Ding, cast around 1200 BCE and weighing 832 kilograms, stands as the largest ancient bronze object ever recovered. Its surface carries geometric patterns, Taioti masks, angular spirals that recur across Shang bronzes with the consistency of sacred vocabulary. These vessels were not decorative. They held offerings of food and wine, presented to royal ancestors during ceremonies that sustained the cosmic order. The royal tombs at Anyang reveal the full weight of Shang power. Lady Fu Hao, a consort of King Wu Ding, who served as both military commander and ritual officiant, was buried around 1200 BCE in a tomb containing 468 bronze objects, 755 jade pieces, and the remains of human sacrifices. Her tomb is exceptional in its preservation. Most royal burials at Anyang were looted in antiquity, but it confirms what the oracle bones suggest, that Shang elites commanded extraordinary resources and believed the afterlife required them in full. The human sacrifices documented at Anyang are not incidental. Entire burial pits contain rows of decapitated individuals, their skulls arranged separately from their bodies. Captives taken in war, servants and retainers accompanied kings into death. The scale is deliberate and systematic, a civilization that understood violence as a form of communication with the sacred. When the Zhou people of the Wei River Valley finally overthrew the last Shang king Di Xin at the Battle of Muye in 1046 BCE, they inherited a world already shaped by 5 centuries of Shang rule. The writing system, the bronze ritual tradition, the concept of ancestral authority, all of these passed forward. The bones fell silent, but the language they had taught China to speak would never stop. The Wei River Valley in late autumn carries a particular quality of light, pale gold filtering through river mist, falling across terraced fields and rammed earth settlements that have stood for generations. It was from this landscape that the Zhou people emerged, not as conquerors from distant steppes, but as neighbors who had watched the Shang Dynasty's power for centuries, absorbed its writing, its bronze rituals, its concept of sacred kingship, and then, in 1046 BCE, dismantled it entirely at the Battle of Muye. The victory required justification. Every conquest does. But the Zhou articulation of legitimacy went far beyond simple claims of military superiority. Their rulers and scholars developed Tianming, the mandate of heaven, a concept so elegant and so adaptable that it would govern Chinese political thought for the next 3,000 years. Heaven, in Zhou cosmology, was not a personal deity, but a moral force, an ordering principle that granted rulers the right to govern. That mandate was conditional, a ruler who governed with virtue, who maintained ritual order and protected his people, retained heaven's sanction. A ruler who descended into cruelty, excess, and disorder would find that sanction withdrawn, signaled through floods, famines, rebellions, and ultimately conquest. The Shang had not been defeated by Zhou armies alone. They had been abandoned by heaven itself. This was not merely theology, it was political architecture of extraordinary sophistication. The mandate of heaven transformed every successful rebellion into a moral event rather than a simple power seizure. It simultaneously legitimized Zhou rule and established the philosophical framework through which all future dynasties would justify their existence, and through which all future rebellions would justify theirs. The Zhou capital at Hao, situated near the Wei River, close to modern Xi'an, was a planned ceremonial center of rammed earth walls, timber-framed palace halls, and ritual spaces designed to reflect cosmic order. The king, now titled the Son of Heaven, stood at the axis between the human world and the celestial realm, performing sacrifices and ceremonies that maintained the harmony between them. Bronze vessels cast during the Western Zhou period bear inscriptions of remarkable length, some exceeding 500 characters, recording royal commands, land grants, military victories, and ritual appointments. These inscriptions are not decorations. They are legal documents cast permanently into metal, witnessed by ancestors and heaven alike. To govern a territory stretching from the Wei River Valley eastward to the Shandong Peninsula and southward toward the Yangtze, the Zhou established a feudal system of 71 vassal states. Lords of these states were relatives of the royal house or trusted allies, bound by ritual obligation, military service, and annual tribute. They built their own walled cities, maintained their own bronze workshops, and conducted their own ancestral ceremonies, but always within a hierarchy that placed the Zhou king at its ceremonial apex. For nearly 3 centuries, this system held. Then, in 771 BCE, nomadic Rong tribes allied with disaffected Zhou nobles sacked the capital at Hao. The king died in the assault. The Western Zhou was over. The court fled eastward to Luoyang, and central authority began its long, slow dissolution. But the ideas forged during those 3 centuries, the mandate of heaven, the ritual obligations of rulership, the moral accountability of power, did not dissolve with the dynasty that created them. They passed forward, intact, into every age that followed. The bamboo strips are narrow, no wider than a finger, their surfaces smoothed and darkened with age. Bound together with silk cord, they form scrolls that once carried the most consequential ideas in Chinese history. In the centuries following the Zhou court's flight to Luoyang in 771 BCE, these strips became the medium through which a civilization argued with itself, debating the nature of power, the obligations of rulers, the source of moral order, and the proper relationship between heaven and humanity. The period that followed the Western Zhou's collapse unfolded in 2 phases. The spring and autumn period, from 771 to 476 BCE, saw dozens of feudal states maneuvering for dominance while nominally acknowledging Zhou authority. The Warring States period, from 476 to 221 BCE, stripped away that pretense entirely. 7 major kingdoms, Qin, Chu, Qi, Yan, Han, Wei, and Zhao, fought with increasing ferocity across a landscape of walled cities, flooded fields, and burning grain stores. Iron weapons replaced bronze. Conscript armies of hundreds of thousands replaced aristocratic chariot warriors. The old ritual order, with its careful hierarchies and ceremonial bronze vessels, was dissolving under the pressure of total war. It was precisely this dissolution that generated philosophy. When inherited structures fail, minds reach for new foundations. Across the competing states, rulers desperate for administrative advantage invited thinkers, strategists, and teachers to their courts. The result was the 100 schools of thought, a flowering of intellectual diversity without parallel in Chinese history. In the small state of Lu, in what is now Shandong province, a teacher named Kong Shu, known to later ages as Confucius, gathered students beneath open skies and within modest halls. Born in 551 BCE, he taught until his death in 479 BCE, reportedly instructing 3,000 students across his lifetime. His method was conversation, his subject, the restoration of moral order. Confucius looked backward to the early Zhou as a model of proper governance, not because he was nostalgic, but because he believed ritual, hierarchy, and benevolent rulership were technologies for maintaining social cohesion. His core concept, Ren, often translated as benevolence or humaneness, placed ethical conduct at the center of political life. The Analects, compiled by his students after his death, preserved his teachings in fragmented exchanges that Chinese scholars would interpret and reinterpret for 2,000 years. Taoism offered a different answer to the same crisis. The text attributed to Laozi, the Tao Te Ching, composed perhaps in the 4th century BCE, argued that the source of disorder was human striving itself. The Tao, the ineffable principle underlying all existence, could not be grasped through ritual or governance, but only through yielding, stillness, and alignment with natural processes. Where Confucius sought to repair civilization, Laozi questioned whether civilization's ambitions were the problem. Mozi, active in the 5th century BCE, rejected both approaches. His philosophy of Jian Ai, universal love, extended equally to all people regardless of kinship, challenged the Confucian emphasis on graded relationships. He also pioneered early logical argumentation and defensive military theory, training craftsmen and engineers alongside philosophers. Han Feizi, writing in the 3rd century BCE for the state of Qin, drew different conclusions entirely. His legalist philosophy argued that human nature was fundamentally self-interested, and that only clear laws, strict punishments, and centralized state power could produce order. Moral cultivation was insufficient. Institutional design was everything. When Qin's rulers absorbed his ideas, they built the administrative machinery that would unify China by 221 BCE. These schools did not merely debate in isolation. Their ideas competed in courts, circulated on bamboo manuscripts carried by traveling scholars, and shaped the policies of kings who were simultaneously fighting for survival. The walls of Qi rose massive and rammed earth solid along the northern frontier. The Chu kingdom's lacquered wooden artifacts, vivid with red and black geometric patterns, reflected a southern culture, absorbing and transforming Zhou traditions on its own terms. Across this fractured landscape, the question was not merely who would win the wars, but whose ideas would govern the civilization that emerged from them. The answer, when it came, would be forged in fire, and it would carry traces of every school that had argued through these centuries of beautiful, terrible disorder. The fire came from the west, from the Loess highlands of the Wei River Valley, where Qin armies had spent generations hardening themselves against nomadic pressure and refining the brutal administrative machinery of legalist governance. The final campaign moved with a precision that the 100 Schools had never theorized, and the warring kingdoms had never anticipated. By 221 BCE, the last rival state had fallen. Ying Zhang, king of Qin, stood at the center of a territory no single ruler had ever governed. 2.2 million square kilometers stretching from the Yellow River's northern bends to the subtropical forests of what is now Guangdong. He did not call himself king. The old title was insufficient for what had been accomplished. Drawing from ancient cosmological vocabulary, he combined the characters for the three legendary sage emperors and the supreme divine sovereign into a single new title, Huangdi, Emperor. He added Qin Shi, first, to mark the rupture with everything that had come before. He intended his dynasty to last 10,000 generations. What followed was not merely political consolidation. It was an attempt to remake the physical and conceptual fabric of civilization itself. The 6 conquered kingdoms had used different written scripts, regional variations that had drifted apart over centuries of separation. Qin's chancellor Li Si imposed a standardized script across the entire empire. Bronze weights and ceramic measures were cast to uniform specifications and distributed to markets from Shandong to Sichuan. Axle widths were standardized so that carts could travel the same rutted roads across provincial boundaries without adjustment. These were not symbolic gestures. They were the infrastructure of a unified state, pressed into material form. The roads came next. 6,800 kilometers of imperial highways radiated outward from the capital Xianyang, near modern Xi'an, their surfaces compacted and their widths regulated. Trees were planted at intervals along the verges. Relay stations allowed imperial couriers to carry edicts across the empire within days. The speed of information had changed. The speed of armies had changed. The empire was not merely a territory, it was a network. Along the northern frontier, Qin Shi Huang dispatched his general Ming Tian with 300,000 soldiers to push back the Xiongnu nomads and begin connecting the existing defensive walls of former kingdoms into a continuous barrier. Rammed earth, stone, and fired brick rose across mountain ridges and river valleys, the earliest form of what later dynasties would extend into the Great Wall. The human cost was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of conscript laborers worked and died along the northern frontier, their bones folded into the foundations of the wall itself. The emperor moved constantly, traveling his road network in a sealed imperial carriage, conducting inspection tours of conquered territories, ascending sacred mountains to perform ritual sacrifices that proclaimed heaven's endorsement of his rule. At Mount Tai in Shandong, the most sacred peak in Chinese cosmology, he carved stone stelae recording his achievements in Li Si's standardized script. The inscriptions survive in fragments. They speak of order restored, of chaos ended, of a world made legible. Yet the same mind that standardized weights and built roads also ordered the burning of books. In 213 BCE, on the advice of Li Si, imperial decree condemned private collections of historical records, philosophical texts, and poetry to destruction, accepting only works on agriculture, medicine, and divination. Scholars who concealed prohibited texts faced execution. Tradition records that 460 scholars were buried alive the following year, though historians debate the precise scale. The legalist state had no patience for the competing loyalties that Confucian texts, Taoist philosophy, and historical memory might cultivate. East of Xianyang, at the foot of Mount Li, construction had begun on a mausoleum of unprecedented ambition. 70 square kilometers of landscape were reshaped. Hundreds of thousands of laborers excavated burial chambers that ancient texts describe as containing rivers of liquid mercury, astronomical maps on the ceiling, and mechanical crossbows set to fire at intruders. Surrounding the burial complex, in 3 excavated pits, stood 8,000 terracotta warriors, infantry, cavalry, archers, and officers, each face individually modeled, each figure painted in vivid pigments now faded to bare clay. They were not symbolic. They were an army positioned in precise military formation, ready to defend an emperor who believed death itself could be administered and controlled. Qin Shi Huang died in 210 BCE during an eastern inspection tour far from his capital. He was 49 years old. His body was transported back to Xianyang, concealed among cartloads of salted fish to mask the smell of decomposition. A final, undignified secret kept by the officials who feared what his death would unleash. The dynasty he had declared eternal would collapse within 4 years. But the standardized script, the road network, the concept of unified imperial rule, these did not collapse. They became the inheritance every subsequent dynasty would claim, adapt, and build upon. The fire from the West had burned through the old world. What grew in its place was China as a single, continuous idea. The empire that replaced the Qin did not arrive with the grandeur of a planned dynasty. It arrived through chaos, through the dust of peasant armies, the collapse of conscript legions, and the unlikely ascent of a man who had once been a minor village official in the state of Chu. Liu Bang was not a philosopher or a prince. He was practical, shrewd, and capable of surrounding himself with people more brilliant than himself. In 206 BCE, after years of civil war against the aristocratic general Xiang Yu, Liu Bang emerged victorious and proclaimed the Han Dynasty. He took the title Emperor Gaozu, the High Ancestor, and established his capital at Changwon on the Wei River plain where Qin's own capital had stood. Chang'an rises in the early morning light as a city of rammed earth walls and broad ceremonial avenues. Its outer walls stretched nearly 25 kilometers in circumference, enclosing palaces, markets, and residential wards arranged in a grid that speaks of deliberate administrative order. By the dynasty's mature years, its population approaches 250,000, a concentration of humanity that few cities anywhere on Earth could match. The Weiyang Palace complex alone covers nearly 5 square kilometers, its lacquered timber halls rising above stone-paved courtyards where officials in layered silk robes move with practiced formality. Gaozu and his immediate successors governed with restraint. They reduced taxes, lightened punishments, and allowed the exhausted population of a unified empire to recover. This policy, called Huanglao governance, drawing on both Taoist and legalist principles, produced decades of quiet prosperity. Granaries filled, roads repaired themselves through use. The population, decimated by Qin's wars and the subsequent civil conflict, began to grow again. The dynasty's transformation came with Emperor Wu, who ascended the throne in 141 BCE at the age of 15 and ruled for 54 years, one of the longest reigns in Chinese history. Wu was not content with consolidation. He pushed Han armies into Central Asia, crushing the Xiongnu Confederacy that had terrorized the northern frontier for generations. He extended Han authority into Korea in the northeast, into Vietnam in the south, and deep into the Tarim Basin in the northwest. The empire under Wu stretched across approximately 6 million square kilometers, a territory comparable to the modern continental United States. To govern this vast domain, Wu needed administrators in enormous numbers. In 124 BCE, he established the Imperial Academy, the Taixue, in Chang'an, initially enrolling 50 students selected for their mastery of Confucian classics. Within decades, enrollment reached thousands. The curriculum centered on 5 canonical texts: the Book of Changes, the Book of Documents, the Book of Songs, the Record of Rites, and the Spring and Autumn Annals. Mastery of these texts became the pathway to official appointment, the first systematic meritocracy in recorded history, a model that would persist, evolve, and endure for 2,000 years. The lacquerware recovered from Mawangdui, near modern Changsha in Hunan province, captures the material world of Han prosperity with extraordinary intimacy. The tombs, sealed around 168 BCE, preserved silk garments so fine they fold into a matchbox, painted wooden figures, medical manuscripts written on silk, and the body of a woman, Lady Dai, so remarkably preserved that her skin retained elasticity 2,000 years after burial. These objects speak not of military conquest, but of a civilization that had learned to live well, that valued beauty, scholarship, and the careful preparation of the dead for whatever lay beyond. Beyond Chang'an's western gates, the Silk Road was opening. Han envoy Zhang Tian had traveled west in 139 BCE, reaching Bactria and Parthia, returning with knowledge of distant kingdoms hungry for Chinese silk. Caravans began moving through the Hexi corridor, past the Jade Gate at Dunhuang, across the Taklamakan Desert's northern and southern routes. Silk traveled westward in bolts of crimson and gold. Glassware, lapis lazuli, and horses of extraordinary quality moved eastward. The Han Empire had not merely unified China, it had connected China to the world. The idea planted by Qin's brutal standardization had grown, under Han governance, into something the first emperor never imagined, a civilization confident enough to reach outward, to trade, to absorb, and to endure. The desert does not forgive carelessness. Across the Taklamakan, whose name in Uyghur carries the meaning, "You go in, you don't come out," summer temperatures reach 50 degrees Celsius, and sandstorms can bury a caravan within hours. Yet for 5 centuries, from roughly 100 BCE onward, merchants, monks, diplomats, and soldiers crossed this terrain with remarkable regularity, threading their way between oasis towns strung like beads along the desert's northern and southern edges. They carried silk. Roman writers described Chinese silk with something approaching bewilderment. Pliny the Elder complained in the 1st century CE that Roman wealth was draining eastward to purchase a fabric so fine it seemed woven from air. In Roman markets, raw silk sold for its weight in gold. Roman senators debated whether it was appropriate for men to wear garments so transparent they revealed the body beneath. They called the people who produced it the Seres, the silk people, and knew almost nothing else about them. The distance between Rome and Han Chang'an was approximately 7,000 kilometers. Almost no one traveled its full length. Instead, goods passed through chains of intermediaries: Parthian merchants, Sogdian traders, Kushan middlemen, each taking a portion of the value before passing the cargo onward. The Sogdians deserve particular attention. Based in the cities of Samarkand and Bukhara in modern Uzbekistan, these Iranian-speaking merchants became the Silk Road's most skilled operators. Sogdian merchant letters, discovered frozen in a watchtower near Dunhuang and dated to approximately 313 CE, reveal commercial networks of extraordinary sophistication, agents stationed across Central Asia, credit arrangements, price intelligence, and family partnerships spanning thousands of kilometers. Sogdian script influenced the development of Mongolian and Tibetan writing systems. Their artistic traditions, visible in painted murals at Afrasiab and in Tang-era Chinese tomb figurines, blended Persian, Indian, Greek, and Chinese visual languages into something entirely their own. At Dunhuang, the roots converged. This oasis town at the edge of the Gobi Desert served as the last Chinese outpost before the desert crossing and the first upon return. Here caravans rested, traded, resupplied, and prayed. And it was here, in 366 CE, that a Buddhist monk named Yue Zun carved the first cave into the sandstone cliffs above the Dachuan River, beginning what would become the Mogao Caves. 492 painted sanctuaries spanning 1,000 years of devotion and artistic exchange. The cave walls preserve bodhisattvas painted in styles that blend Gandharan Greek influence with Chinese brushwork, their halos echoing Hellenistic sun imagery, their robes falling in folds that recall both Indian sculpture and Han silk painting. Buddhism itself had traveled the Silk Road eastward. Originating in northern India in the 5th century BCE, it reached Central Asia through the Qin Empire and entered China along the trade routes during the 1st century CE. Han court records mention Buddhist practices by 65 CE. The religion offered something Confucian philosophy did not: a systematic account of suffering, rebirth, and liberation that addressed the anxieties of ordinary people rather than the obligations of officials. By the 2nd century CE, Buddhist monasteries were established in Luoyang. By the 4th century, translation bureaus staffed by Central Asian monks were rendering Sanskrit sutras into Chinese, creating a new literary language that would shape Chinese prose for centuries. What moved along the Silk Road was never only goods. Roman glassware, transparent blown glass of a quality Chinese craftsmen could not yet replicate, appeared in Han tombs. Chinese bronze mirrors reached Roman Syria. Musical instruments, crop varieties, paper-making techniques, and astronomical knowledge crossed the same routes as silk bolts and spice jars. The Silk Road was not a highway, but a living system, fragile, dependent on political stability across dozens of kingdoms, yet resilient enough to function across 4 centuries of Han power and beyond its collapse. When the Han Dynasty finally fractured in 220 CE, the roots did not close. They simply found new patrons, new intermediaries, new reasons to remain open. The world, once connected, proved reluctant to disconnect. The Yangtze River moves differently than the Yellow River, where the North's great waterway cuts through Loess plains in broad, silt-heavy curves. The Yangtze descends through gorges of dark limestone, its current faster, its banks steeper, its valley greener and more enclosed. For centuries, Han Chinese civilization had looked northward, toward the Yellow River, toward the Central Plains, toward the imperial capitals of Chang'an and Luoyang. The south was peripheral. By 220 CE, that orientation would begin to change permanently. The Han Dynasty did not end in a single catastrophic moment. It dissolved across decades of famine, epidemic, and warlord fragmentation. The Yellow Turban Rebellion of 184 CE had already shattered the dynasty's military coherence before its formal collapse. What emerged from the wreckage were 3 distinct power centers, each claiming legitimacy, each commanding armies, each building administrative structures that mirrored the imperial system they had replaced. Cao Cao, the northern chancellor whose military genius had reunified much of the Yellow River Basin, never declared himself emperor. His son Cao Pi did, in 220 CE, establishing the kingdom of Wei with its capital at Luoyang. Within months, Liu Bei, a Han imperial kinsman, proclaimed the kingdom of Shu from Chengdu in the Sichuan Basin. Sun Quan consolidated the kingdom of Wu across the Yangtze Delta and southeastern coast, ruling from Jianye, the city that would later become Nanjing. The geography of division was not accidental. Wei controlled the agricultural heartland of the north, the millet fields, the iron foundries, the population centers. Shu occupied the Sichuan Basin, a naturally fortified region of extraordinary fertility, ringed by mountains that made invasion difficult and defense possible. Wu commanded the waterways, the Yangtze tributaries, the coastal ports, the shipbuilding traditions that gave its armies mobility no northern cavalry force could easily counter. 3 different landscapes produced 3 different military and economic strategies, and 3 different visions of what China might become. The human cost of this fragmentation defies easy comprehension. Census records from the late Han recorded a population of approximately 60 million. By 280 CE, when the Qin Dynasty briefly reunified the 3 kingdoms, surviving records suggest a population of perhaps 16 million. The causes were multiple and compounding: warfare, famine, epidemic disease, and the collapse of the irrigation and flood control infrastructure that Han administration had maintained. Entire counties emptied. Agricultural land returned to scrub. The demographic catastrophe reshaped settlement patterns across the subcontinent for generations. Zhuge Liang, Chancellor of Shu, understood the arithmetic of weakness. His northern campaigns against Wei, 5 separate expeditions launched between 228 and 234 CE across the Qinling Mountains, were not expressions of optimism, but calculated attempts to destabilize a stronger enemy before Shu's relative disadvantage became insurmountable. Each campaign ended in withdrawal, constrained by supply lines stretched across impossible terrain. Zhuge Liang died on campaign in 234 CE at the Wuzhong Plains, his final expedition unresolved. His reputation for strategic brilliance, administrative precision, and personal integrity outlasted every military outcome, becoming the model of the loyal minister that Chinese political culture would invoke for 2,000 years. The southern migration that accelerated during these centuries carried more than refugees. It carried seeds, techniques, written texts, and craft knowledge. Han Chinese settlers moving into the Yangtze Valley and beyond encountered indigenous populations, the Yue peoples of the southeast, the Ba and Shu cultures of Sichuan, and the resulting agricultural synthesis transformed southern China. Wet rice cultivation, already practiced in the Yangtze Delta, expanded dramatically as northern farmers adapted to southern conditions. The South, once marginal, was becoming the economic foundation of whatever unified China would eventually emerge. That reunification came not through the 3 kingdoms themselves, but through their exhaustion. The Qin Dynasty absorbed Wei, then Shu, then Wu by 280 CE, but Qin's unity proved fragile. Civil war among Qin princes, combined with the southward pressure of nomadic confederacies, Xiongnu, Xianbei, Di, Jie, Qiang, shattered northern China again after 304 CE. The period known as the 16 Kingdoms saw northern China fragment into a succession of short-lived states, many ruled by non-Han dynasties. The eastern Qin court retreated to Jiangkang on the Yangtze, governing a southern rump state while the north burned. 3 more centuries would pass before a ruler strong enough to reunite the whole emerged from the ruins. 3 centuries of fracture leave marks that outlast the fractures themselves. The roads between northern cities had grown uncertain, the grain routes disrupted, the old administrative networks frayed into local arrangements that served warlords rather than any unified state. When Yang Zhan, a northern aristocrat of mixed Han and Xianbei descent, seized power in 581 CE and proclaimed the Sui dynasty, he inherited not a broken empire, but the memory of one. His task was to make that memory physical again. Yang Jian ruled as Emperor Wen. His methods were precise and unsentimental. He reorganized the bureaucracy, abolished redundant offices, and reimposed the equal field land system that distributed agricultural plots to peasant households in exchange for tax and military service. He standardized coinage and grain measures across territories that had spent generations operating under incompatible systems. In 589 CE, his armies crossed the Yangtze and absorbed the last southern dynasty, the Qin, completing a reunification that had eluded every ruler since the Han's collapse nearly 4 centuries earlier. The speed was remarkable. The durability would prove less so. The canal begins as a practical problem. Northern China consumed grain, but increasingly struggled to produce it in sufficient quantities. Southern China, the Yangtze Delta, and the regions below had spent 3 centuries of refugee settlement transforming wetlands into paddies, developing strains of rice that yielded harvests the North could not match. The distance between surplus and need was geographic, and geography, Emperor Yang believed, could be engineered. Emperor Yang, Yang Jian's son, who took power in 604 CE, ordered the construction of a waterway system that would connect the Yellow River Basin to the Yangtze Valley. The Grand Canal was not built from nothing. It incorporated older regional channels, dredged and extended and linked into a continuous network, stretching approximately 2,700 kilometers. The labor came from conscription. Contemporary sources record that over 1 million workers were mobilized for the canal's southern sections alone, with additional millions pressed into service for northern extensions. The earth removed from canal beds was piled into embankments. Stone sluice gates controlled water levels. Imperial post stations appeared at regular intervals along the banks. The human cost was severe. Mortality among conscripted laborers reached proportions that entered the historical record as a grievance. Families lost fathers and sons to construction projects that followed one another without pause. The canal, then a new eastern capital at Luoyang, then the reconstruction of the Great Wall's northern sections, then the Korean campaigns. Emperor Yang's ambitions extended beyond infrastructure. The Goguryeo kingdom of the Korean peninsula had refused submission to Sui authority. Between 612 and 614 CE, Yang launched 3 massive invasions, mobilizing forces that ancient sources place at over 1 million soldiers for the first campaign alone. All 3 failed. The terrain was difficult, the supply lines extended, and Goguryeo's defenders proved resilient. The armies that returned were diminished and exhausted. The armies that did not return became the foundation of popular rage. By 613 CE, rebellion had begun spreading across the empire's interior. The tax burden, the conscription levies, the grain requisitions for campaigns that produced nothing. These accumulated into the conditions that had destroyed dynasties before. Emperor Yang withdrew to the southern city of Jiangdu on the canal he had built, and there, in 618 CE, his own guards killed him. The Sui dynasty, which had reunified China after 4 centuries of division, lasted only 37 years. What remained was the canal itself. Water still moved through those engineered channels, still carried grain from south to north, still connected markets and cities along its embankments. The dynasty that built it vanished. The infrastructure it left behind became the circulatory system of every Chinese empire that followed, a permanent alteration of the land that no subsequent ruler would undo, because no subsequent ruler could afford to. The man who inherited the Sui's infrastructure was not the man who built it. Li Yuan, a Sui military commander of mixed Chinese and Turkic aristocratic descent, seized Chang'an in 617 CE and proclaimed the Tang Dynasty the following year. He had watched the Sui destroy itself through overreach, and he governed accordingly, carefully, incrementally, preserving what worked and discarding what had broken its predecessor. The Tang inherited the canal, the road network, the administrative framework, and the walled capital. What it added was something the Sui never possessed: duration and the confidence that duration produces. Chang'an under the Tang was not merely a large city. It was a proposition about what civilization could be. Laid out on a strict grid of 1 to 8 walled residential and commercial wards, the city stretched across 84 square kilometers of the Wei River Plain, larger than any contemporary city in the world. Its population, by the early 8th century, exceeded 1 million within the walls, with perhaps another million in surrounding districts. The eastern and western markets operated under government regulation, their stalls organized by trade, silk merchants beside lacquerware dealers, spice traders beside metal workers. Persian and Sogdian merchants maintained permanent residences in the western wards. Zoroastrian fire temples, Nestorian Christian churches, and Islamic mosques stood within the same city that housed Buddhist monasteries and Taoist temples. No other city on Earth in 700 CE contained such density of intersecting worlds. The dynasty's second emperor, Taizong, who took power in 626 CE after a palace coup against his own father, understood that Tang's strength lay in its openness. He accepted the submission of Turkic tribal leaders and incorporated their cavalry into Tang armies, earning the title Heavenly Kagan from the steppe peoples alongside his Chinese imperial title. His court employed officials regardless of ethnic origin. The examination system, which the Sui had formalized, expanded under Tang administration, drawing talent from across the empire into a meritocratic bureaucracy that filtered candidates through rigorous testing in classical literature, law, and governance. Empress Wu Zetian, who rose from imperial consort to sole ruler, reigning as emperor from 690 to 705 CE, pushed this system further. She expanded examination access, added poetry composition as a required subject, and promoted officials based on demonstrated ability rather than aristocratic lineage. Her reign was contested, her methods ruthless, her political intelligence formidable. She remains the only woman in Chinese history to have ruled in her own name, and the examination reform she implemented outlasted every criticism leveled against her. Tang poetry emerged from this environment of competitive literary culture. Li Bai composed verse of luminous spontaneity, images of moonlight, wine, and mountain solitude that felt effortless and were anything but. Du Fu wrote with documentary precision, recording the textures of ordinary life and political anxiety with a moral seriousness that later generations would call the conscience of Tang literature. Both men lived during the dynasty's peak decades, when Chang'an's prosperity made beauty feel like a natural condition of existence. The material culture matched the intellectual. Tang Sansai ceramics, lead-glazed earthenware fired in amber, cream, and cobalt blue, captured the dynasty's aesthetic in physical form: vivid, confident, technically assured. Figures of Central Asian musicians, Bactrian camels, and Persian horsemen appear among Tang tomb goods, each one a record of the cosmopolitan world moving through Chang'an's gates. Silk robes worn at court incorporated Central Asian floral patterns alongside traditional Chinese motifs. The boundaries between cultures were not erased. They were worn as ornament, displayed as sophistication. The Dunhuang cave temples, deep in the Gansu corridor, accumulated Tang-era paintings of extraordinary refinement during these same decades. Bodhisattvas rendered in warm ochres and mineral blues float across cave walls, their robes detailed with the same confident brushwork that characterized Tang court painting. The caves record not only Buddhist devotion, but the visual vocabulary of a civilization at the height of its powers, certain of its place, generous with its attention, capable of absorbing the entire known world and making it Chinese. The confidence did not shatter all at once. It cracked first along the northern frontier, where the Tang Dynasty had stationed its most powerful armies under commanders called jiedushi, regional military governors who controlled troops, taxation, and territory simultaneously. The system had worked while loyalty held. In 755 CE, it stopped holding, and Lushan, a military governor of Sogdian Turkish descent, commanding 3 northeastern frontier circuits, marched his army southward in December of that year. His forces numbered perhaps 150,000, battle-hardened border troops against the interior garrisons that had grown soft during decades of peace. The eastern capital, Luoyang, fell within weeks. Chang'an fell in 756 CE. Emperor Xuanzong, the same ruler who had presided over Tang's cultural zenith, fled southwest towards Sichuan along mountain roads, his court reduced to a column of refugees moving through rain and mud. At a relay station called Mawei, his own imperial guard refused to continue until Yang Guifei, the emperor's beloved consort, whose family had accumulated enormous political power, was executed. She was strangled with a length of silk. The emperor continued into exile. The image of that moment, a civilization's confidence measured against a silk cord, passed into Chinese poetry and never fully left. Du Fu, then moving through the chaos as a displaced official, recorded what the rebellion produced on the ground. His verses describe empty villages, unburied dead, smoke rising from farmsteads, children separated from parents on roads leading nowhere safe. These are not decorative laments. Census records from the period confirm the scale. China's registered population fell from approximately 53 million households before the rebellion to roughly 17 million afterward. A collapse that reflects both mass death and the complete breakdown of administrative reach across vast territories. The rebellion itself lasted 8 years, ending in 763 CE, not through Tang military triumph, but through fragile negotiation and the eventual fracturing of the rebel coalition. And Lushan was murdered by his own son in 757 CE. His successor, Shi Siming, was murdered in turn. Tang forces, reinforced by Uyghur cavalry allies, whose assistance came at significant political cost, recaptured Chang'an and Luoyang. But the empire that emerged from the rebellion was structurally different from the one that had entered it. The jiedushi system, which had produced and Lushan, was not dismantled. It was multiplied. Regional governors across the empire now held autonomous military and fiscal power that the central court could not reclaim without triggering further conflict. The examination system continued producing officials, but those officials increasingly served regional powers rather than the imperial center. Tax revenues that had once flowed to Chang'an now pooled in provincial capitals. Late Tang Buddhist art registers this transformation in its own visual language. The cave temples at Dunhuang, continuing their accumulation of painted walls through the 8th and 9th centuries, show a subtle shift in tone. The confident, expansive compositions of the early Tang give way to more introspective imagery. Bodhisattvas rendered with greater psychological interiority. donor portraits that emphasize local patrons rather than imperial connections. The art remains extraordinary, but its relationship to centralized power has changed. The dynasty endured for nearly a century and a half after the rebellion's end, but it endured as a diminished thing. The great poets of the late Tang, among them Li Shangyin, whose verses are dense with melancholy and layered allusion, wrote in a register quite different from Li Bai's earlier exuberance. Where Tang poetry had once celebrated the world's abundance, it now meditated on impermanence. In 907 CE, a warlord named Zhu Wen deposed the last Tang emperor and ended the dynasty entirely. Chang'an, once the world's largest city, was deliberately demolished, its population dispersed, its great grid of wards and markets reduced to foundations in the lowest. What the Tang left behind was not ruin alone. Its poetry, its ceramic forms, its Buddhist iconography, its administrative vocabulary, all of these passed forward into the dynasties that followed, carried by the same examination-trained officials who had served it. Civilizations do not simply end. They transform, compress, and continue in altered forms through the people who survive them. The chaos that followed the Tang's dissolution lasted half a century. 5 dynasties rose and collapsed across the north in rapid succession, each lasting less than 20 years. 10 independent kingdoms fragmented the south. Then, in 960 CE, a military commander named Zhao Kuang-yin staged a coup so bloodless it seemed almost choreographed. His soldiers draped a yellow imperial robe over his shoulders before he had time to refuse it. He became Emperor Taizu, founder of the Shang Dynasty, and he spent the next 16 years reunifying most of China through a combination of military pressure and negotiated surrender. His methods of consolidation were deliberate. Knowing that Tang's collapse had been accelerated by autonomous military governors, Taizu systematically transferred power from generals to civilian administrators. The examination system expanded dramatically. Where Tang had produced perhaps a few hundred Jinshi degree holders per generation, Song produced thousands. A new class of scholar officials, educated, commercially minded, philosophically sophisticated, became the dynasty's governing backbone. The economy they administered was unlike anything the medieval world had seen. Song China's iron production reached approximately 125,000 tons annually by the 11th century, more than all of Europe combined. Enormous state-run foundries in Hebei province cast agricultural tools, weapons, and construction materials at industrial scale. Coal, mined extensively in northern China, fueled furnaces that burned hotter and longer than charcoal ever could. The landscape around major production centers was stripped of trees within decades, a visible sign of an economy running at extraordinary intensity. Commerce moved through paper. The jiaozi, the world's first government-issued paper currency, emerged in Sichuan province around 1023 CE, replacing the heavy iron coins that merchants had struggled to transport across mountain roads. By the Southern Song period, paper money circulated through a monetized economy of remarkable complexity, supported by government treasuries, merchant credit networks, and a banking infrastructure that extended from Hangzhou to the ports of Guangzhou. Around 1040 CE, a commoner craftsman named Bi Sheng pressed individual Chinese characters into fired clay, creating movable type. The technology allowed texts to be composed, printed, and redistributed at speeds impossible with hand copying. Government documents, philosophical treatises, agricultural manuals, and popular fiction all moved through a publishing industry that made knowledge accessible far beyond the scholar class. Gunpowder, known since the Tang era, became weaponized systematically under Song military engineers, facing constant pressure from northern nomadic powers. Fire arrows, explosive bombs packed in ceramic casings, and early proto-cannons called fire lances appeared in Song arsenals by the 10th and 11th centuries. The magnetic compass, refined from earlier Chinese geomantic instruments, enabled Song merchant vessels to navigate the South China Sea and Indian Ocean with confidence regardless of cloud cover. When the Qin Dynasty shattered the northern Song in 1127 CE, capturing Emperor Huizong and his son, dragging them north as prisoners, the court fled south across the Yangtze. The southern Song established its capital at Hangzhou, a city of canals, merchant guilds, and tea-houses that grew to perhaps 1.5 million inhabitants. Its markets sold silk, porcelain, printed books, spiced foods, and imported goods from across maritime Asia. Marco Polo, arriving in the 1270s, called it the greatest city on earth, a judgment that was not hyperbole. The porcelain workshops of Jingdezhen in Jiangxi province produced celadon-glazed vessels of extraordinary refinement, thin-walled, translucent, cool in color as morning mist over still water. Song landscape painting reached a philosophical depth unmatched in Chinese art history. Vast mountain ranges rendered in ink wash, human figures reduced to near invisibility against the scale of cliffs and clouds. The natural world presented not as backdrop, but as subject. These paintings were not decorations. They were arguments about the relationship between human consciousness and the cosmos. The Southern Song endured until 1279 CE, when Mongol forces completed their conquest at the naval battle of Yamen, where the last Song loyalists, refusing surrender, drowned with the child emperor in the South China Sea. What they left behind was a civilization that had transformed the material conditions of human life, not through conquest, but through ingenuity applied quietly, persistently, across 3 centuries of extraordinary invention. The horsemen came from the north, from the steppe grasslands beyond the Gobi Desert, where the sky sits low and the wind carries no memory of walls. Genghis Khan's armies first struck northern China in 1211 CE, breaching the defenses of the Qin Dynasty and beginning a campaign of annihilation that would reshape the demographic map of East Asia. Cities that resisted were erased. Populations that fled found little safety. By the time Genghis Khan died in 1227 CE, northern China had been transformed into a landscape of ruins and silence, its population reduced by millions through warfare, famine, and displacement. The conquest continued under his successors. Kublai Khan, Genghis's grandson, completed what his grandfather had begun. In 1271 CE, he proclaimed the Yuan dynasty, adopting Chinese imperial terminology while maintaining Mongol cultural identity. 8 years later, at the naval battle of Yamen in 1279 CE, the last southern Song resistance collapsed. For the first time in its history, all of China fell under foreign rule. Estimates suggest the Mongol conquest killed between 30 and 40 million people across the Chinese territories. One of the most catastrophic demographic events in human history. Kublai Khan established his capital at Khanbalik, the city of the Great Khan, built on the foundations of what is now Beijing. The city was designed on a grid of extraordinary precision, wide avenues, massive palace complexes, and walls of rammed earth and fired brick, enclosing a space that announced imperial ambition on a continental scale. The Grand Canal was extended northward to supply this new capital with grain from the Yangtze Delta, completing an infrastructure network that connected China's agricultural south to its political north across more than 3,000 kilometers of engineered waterway. Yet Kublai Khan's ambitions extended beyond China's shores. In 1274 and again in 1281 CE, he launched seaborne invasions of Japan, armadas of hundreds of vessels carrying tens of thousands of soldiers. Both campaigns ended in catastrophe, the fleets destroyed by storms that Japanese tradition would name kamikaze, the divine winds. An attempted invasion of Java in 1293 CE met similar failure. The ocean, unlike the steppe, refused to yield to Mongol strategy. What the Yuan dynasty achieved instead was something more durable than military conquest. It became the central node of the largest connected trading world the pre-modern era had ever produced. Merchants, diplomats, missionaries, and travelers moved across Mongol-controlled territories from the Pacific coast to the Black Sea. Marco Polo arrived at Kublai's court in the 1270s and spent 17 years in Yuan service. His later account describing Khan Balik's markets, Hangzhou's canals, and the administrative sophistication of a civilization that dwarfed anything in contemporary Europe. The material culture of this exchange left permanent marks. Yuan artisans, working with cobalt pigment imported from Persia, developed blue and white porcelain, white ceramic bodies painted with intricate cobalt blue designs and sealed under transparent glaze. The aesthetic was unprecedented, a fusion of Chinese ceramic mastery and Islamic decorative tradition born from the collision of civilizations. These vessels traveled westward along trade routes and transformed ceramic aesthetics from Persia to Portugal, their visual language absorbed into traditions that had no knowledge of their origin. The Yuan dynasty also witnessed the flourishing of Chinese vernacular drama. Zaju, a form combining music, spoken dialogue, and acrobatic performance, reached artistic maturity under Mongol rule, partly because the suspension of civil examinations pushed educated men toward popular entertainment rather than bureaucratic careers. The manuscripts that survive from this period represent a literature of displacement and ingenuity, written in the language of ordinary speech rather than classical formality. The dynasty's internal contradictions proved fatal. Mongol rulers maintained ethnic hierarchies that excluded most Chinese from senior administrative positions. Flooding of the Yellow River in the 1340s triggered famine and displacement on a massive scale. The Red Turban Rebellion erupted in 1351 CE, drawing on millenarian Buddhist traditions and peasant fury. By 1368 CE, rebel forces had captured Khan Balik, and the last Yuan emperor fled north to the steppe. The Mongol century in China was over, but the blue and white porcelain remained. And the Hutong alleyways of Beijing still follow the grid that Kublai Khan's architects laid down 700 years before. From the ruins of Mongol authority, a new order rose, and it rose from the lowest possible origin. Zhu Yuanzhang had been born in 1328 CE into a family so destitute that when plague and famine killed his parents and brothers, he could not afford to bury them. He begged at a Buddhist monastery. He wandered. He survived. By 1368 CE, this same man sat on the dragon throne in Nanjing, having led peasant armies across a fractured continent to found the Ming Dynasty. A name meaning brightness, clarity, the restoration of light after a long darkness. Nanjing became the first Ming capital, and Zhu Yuanzhang, now Emperor Hongwu, rebuilt it with ferocious energy. The city walls he constructed still stand today, 35 kilometers of fired brick, the longest surviving city wall in the world, rising in places to 21 meters. Inside those walls, Hongwu dismantled the Yuan's ethnic hierarchies and rebuilt the Confucian examination system, insisting that talent, not ancestry, would determine who governed. He was suspicious, often brutal, executing tens of thousands of officials he suspected of corruption or disloyalty. But the administrative architecture he constructed gave the Ming dynasty its enduring skeleton. His fourth son did not wait for inheritance. In 1402 CE, the Prince of Yan seized the throne from his nephew in a civil war, took the reign name Yongle, perpetual happiness, and immediately began remaking China in his own image. His first decision was to move the capital northward to Beijing, closer to the Mongol frontier he understood from decades of military command. His second decision was to build something the world had never seen. Between 1406 and 1420 CE, roughly 1 million laborers, conscripted workers, skilled craftsmen, soldiers, constructed the Forbidden City on Beijing's central axis. 100 million bricks were fired and transported. Enormous timber columns of Nanmu hardwood were floated down rivers from Sichuan and Yunnan, some trunks requiring years to reach the capital. White marble balustrades were carved and hauled from quarries outside Beijing, on sledges lubricated with water poured across frozen ground in winter. The result was 980 buildings arranged across 72 hectares, enclosed behind walls 10 meters high and a moat 52 meters wide. Vermilion walls, golden glazed roof tiles, and vast ceremonial courtyards created a geometry of power so precise that the entire complex aligned on a single meridian running north to south through the city. While the Forbidden City rose, Yongle was already planning something equally extraordinary at sea. Admiral Zheng He, a Muslim eunuch from Yunnan province, a man of enormous physical stature and administrative genius, commanded 7 treasure fleet voyages between 1405 and 1433 CE. The fleets were staggering in scale: 300 vessels, 28,000 men, and treasure ships reaching 137 meters in length, approximately 5 times the size of Columbus's Santa Maria, which would not sail for another 6 decades. These armadas visited Southeast Asia, India, Arabia, and the East African coast, collecting tribute, establishing diplomatic relationships, and carrying giraffes back to Beijing as living proof of the empire's reach. The blue and white porcelain that traveled aboard those ships, produced in the kilns of Jingdezhen using cobalt blue inherited from Yuan-era Persian trade, became the visual signature of Ming China across the Indian Ocean world. Fragments of Ming porcelain surface today in archaeological sites from Mozambique to the Malabar coast, quiet evidence of a maritime presence that predated European expansion into those same waters by nearly a century. Yongle died in 1424 CE on campaign against the Mongols. The treasure voyages continued briefly under his successors, the last departing in 1431 CE and returning in 1433. Then they stopped, permanently. The Confucian bureaucracy that had always viewed maritime expenditure as wasteful reasserted itself, and China's gaze turned inward. The ships rotted in their harbors. The records of the voyages were partially destroyed. What remained was the Forbidden City, still standing at Beijing's heart, and the memory of fleets that had once made the Indian Ocean a Chinese lake. When the treasure fleet ceased sailing, China did not fall silent. It turned its extraordinary energies inward, toward its own cities, its own soil, its own intricate social architecture. The Ming dynasty after 1433 CE was not a civilization in retreat. It was a civilization consolidating, deepening, and in many ways flourishing with an intensity that the outward-looking years had never quite permitted. The examination halls tell this story most plainly. Across the empire, from provincial capitals to county seats, candidates gathered in rows of narrow stone cells, each barely wide enough to turn around in, to compete for the degrees that determined everything. The imperial examination system demanded that candidates memorize approximately 400,000 characters of classical text, the 4 books, the 5 classics, the accumulated weight of Confucian thought stretching back 1,000 years. The final test required composition of the 8-legged essay, a rigidly structured form of argumentation divided into 8 precise sections, each governed by rules of parallelism and rhythm as demanding as any poetic form. A man might spend 30 years preparing. Many never passed, yet the system endured because it offered something genuinely rare in the pre-modern world: the theoretical possibility that a farmer's son could become a minister of state through intellect alone. While scholars bent over their brushes in examination cells, the kilns of Jingdezhen burned without pause. This city in Jiangxi province had become the ceramic capital of the world, a place where the pale kaolin clay of the surrounding hills was transformed through temperatures exceeding 1,300 degrees into porcelain of translucent perfection. By the 15th and 16th centuries, Jingdezhen's workshops were producing roughly 100,000 pieces annually, supplying imperial palaces, domestic markets, and an expanding global trade that carried Ming, blue and white porcelain to Ottoman Istanbul, Safavid Persia, Renaissance Florence, and the courts of Southeast Asian kings. The cobalt blue that defined Ming porcelain's visual identity had originally arrived from Persia along the Silk Road, a detail that speaks to how deeply China's material culture had absorbed and transformed foreign influences into something unmistakably its own. In Suzhou, a different kind of beauty took shape. The city's scholar officials and wealthy merchants constructed private gardens that compressed entire landscapes into spaces measured in courtyards. Limestone rocks from Lake Tai, eroded into fantastical shapes, stood beside reflecting pools edged with bamboo and flowering plum. Covered walkways connected pavilions named for seasons and states of mind. These gardens were not decorative retreats. They were philosophical statements, arguments in stone and water about the proper relationship between human cultivation and natural form. The printing houses of Nanjing and Suzhou fed an increasingly literate commercial population with woodblock printed novels, drama collections, encyclopedias, and illustrated medical texts. The novel as a literary form reached new sophistication in this period, with vernacular fiction circulating among audiences far beyond the classical educated elite. Into this world came Wang Yangming, philosopher, general, and one of the most original minds the Ming produced. Against the orthodox Neo-Confucian position that moral knowledge was acquired through exhaustive study of classical texts, Wang argued that the capacity for moral understanding was innate in every human being. Knowledge and action, he insisted, were not separate stages but a single unified process. His ideas spread rapidly through the educated classes, generating a philosophical movement that challenged institutional authority with quiet but persistent force. A reminder that even in its most inward-looking decades, Ming China remained a civilization capable of reinventing its own foundations. The restless questions had no time to find answers. By the opening decades of the 17th century, the Ming Dynasty was no longer merely philosophically unsettled. It was structurally failing, pressed from every direction by forces that no examination-trained bureaucrat had been prepared to manage simultaneously. The climate turned first. Across the 1620s and 1630s, the Little Ice Age tightened its grip on northern China with unusual severity. Growing seasons shortened. The Loess Plateau, already fragile, cracked under successive droughts. Harvests failed not once, but year after year across Shanxi, Henan, and Shaanxi provinces. The agricultural heartland that had fed dynasties for millennia. Locust swarms followed drought. Famine followed locusts. In some counties, official records noted that families consumed bark, then leather, then each other. The tax collectors still arrived. The Wanli Emperor had already hollowed out the administrative response. Reigning from 1572 to 1620, he had spent the final decades of his rule in near total seclusion inside the Forbidden City, refusing to hold court audiences, refusing to fill vacant bureaucratic posts, refusing to read memorials. For years, entire ministries operated without appointed heads. The examination system produced graduates who could compose flawless eight-legged essays, but found no offices waiting for them. The machinery of governance seized. Silver made the crisis global in character. Ming China's commercial economy had become deeply dependent on silver flowing from Spanish-American mines through Manila. Payment for the porcelain, silk, and goods that Chinese merchants exported across the Pacific. When that flow disrupted in the 1620s, as Spain's empire strained and trade contracted, Chinese markets convulsed. Merchants who had built fortunes on export commerce found credit collapsing. The monetized economy that Song ingenuity had pioneered now transmitted distant shocks directly into Chinese villages. Into the famine zones rode Li Zicheng, a former postal worker from Shanxi who had lost his position in government budget cuts. He joined the roving bandit armies that famine had generated across the Northwest. By the late 1630s, he commanded tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands, of desperate men who had nothing left to lose. His movement was not merely brigandage. He promised tax relief and land redistribution. The starving listened. By April 1644, Li Zicheng's forces stood before Beijing. The city's defenders, unpaid and demoralized, offered little resistance. On April 24th, the gates opened. The Chongzhen Emperor, the 16th and last Ming Emperor, who had reigned since 1627 with genuine effort but catastrophic misfortune, spent his final hours ordering his empress and concubines to die rather than face capture. He walked alone to Coal Hill, the artificial mound rising just north of the Forbidden City, and hanged himself from a locust tree. On his robe, he left words accepting personal blame while asking that his people be spared. The robe survives. The dynasty did not. The story did not end with Li Zicheng. A Ming general named Wu Sangui, commanding the last organized imperial army at Shanhai Guan Pass, where the Great Wall meets the sea, faced an impossible choice. Rather than submit to the rebel, he opened the pass to the Manchu armies massing beyond. Within weeks, Manchu cavalry entered Beijing. Li Zicheng fled and died within the year. The Qing Dynasty had begun, not through conquest alone, but through the Ming's own fracture. China's population, which had approached 200 million, would fall toward 150 million before the transition's violence finally exhausted itself. The Manchu were not strangers to China when they crossed the Great Wall in 1644. For decades they had studied Chinese administration, recruited Han advisors, and built a state modeled on the very dynasty they intended to replace. What followed was not simple conquest. It was absorption, negotiation, and the careful construction of a dual identity. The Qing presented themselves to Han subjects as legitimate heirs to the mandate of heaven, while maintaining Manchu language, martial traditions, and the distinctive Q hairstyle they required all Han men to adopt under penalty of death. The early decades were violent. Southern China resisted for a generation. The last Ming pretenders were hunted across Yunnan and into Burma. Taiwan held out under the loyalist Zheng family until 1683. But when Emperor Kangxi finally consolidated control, ruling from 1661 to 1722 in the longest reign of any Chinese emperor, the dynasty entered a period of extraordinary stability. Kangxi was a scholar warrior who personally led campaigns against the Dzungar Mongols, studied mathematics with Jesuit missionaries at court, and commissioned the Kangxi Dictionary, 47,035 Chinese characters compiled into a single authoritative reference that standardized written Chinese for 2 centuries. Under Kangxi's son Yongzheng, who ruled from 1722 to 1735, the administrative machinery tightened further. Yongzheng worked 18-hour days, annotating memorials in vermilion ink, routing out corruption with systematic ferocity. He created the Grand Council, a small inner cabinet that bypassed the traditional bureaucracy, concentrating decision-making power directly beneath the emperor's hand. The state became more efficient and more centralized than any previous Chinese dynasty had managed. Then came Qianlong, who ascended in 1735 and reigned for 60 years, deliberately abdicating in 1796 to avoid surpassing his grandfather Kangxi's record. Under Qianlong, the empire reached its greatest territorial extent, 13 million square kilometers absorbing Tibet, Xinjiang, Mongolia, and Taiwan into a single administrative structure. Military campaigns pushed into Central Asia, Nepal, and Burma. China's population, recovering from the Ming-Qing transition's devastation, climbed from roughly 150 million toward 300 million, fed by New World crops, particularly sweet potatoes and maize, that transformed marginal hillside land into productive farmland. Northwest of Beijing, the Ming Yuan, the Garden of Perfect Brightness, spread across 350 hectares of artificial lakes, sculpted rockeries, and pavilions housing the imperial collection. Jesuit missionaries, including Giuseppe Castiglione, designed a European section featuring Baroque stone fountains and palace facades, an extraordinary architectural conversation between civilizations, rendered in marble beside lacquered Chinese halls. Qianlong himself composed over 40,000 poems. He commissioned the Siku Quanshu, a systematic compilation of Chinese literature across 4 categories: classics, history, philosophy, and belles lettres. Assembling 36,000 volumes through the labor of 15,000 copyists working across 10 years. It was the largest editorial project in human history. Simultaneously, texts deemed politically dangerous were identified and destroyed, the compilation and the suppression proceeding in parallel. At Canton, the single port through which Western trade was permitted, merchant vessels from Britain, the Netherlands, and Portugal unloaded silver and carried away silk, tea, and porcelain. The world wanted what China produced. China largely did not want what the world offered in return. Under Qianlong, China generated approximately 1/3 of global gross domestic product, a proportion that made the empire not merely powerful, but structurally central to the world economy. The Canton trading houses, their warehouses stacked with Jingdezhen porcelain wrapped in straw, processed a volume of commerce that no other single port on earth could match. The Qing zenith was real, measurable, and magnificent. It was also, in ways not yet visible from within the vermilion walls of the Forbidden City, already approaching its limits. Population growth was outpacing agricultural expansion, the bureaucracy was growing rigid, and beyond the horizon, in workshops along the rivers of northern England, a different kind of power was being assembled, one that burned coal rather than burned incense, and that would, within a century, arrive at China's coastline, demanding entry on entirely different terms. The workshops of northern England were not the only pressure building beyond China's awareness. Within the empire itself, the long equilibrium of the Qing zenith was fracturing along lines invisible to the court in Beijing. Population had doubled across the 18th century, pressing against the limits of arable land. Flooding along the Yellow River intensified. Provincial granaries, once carefully maintained, grew unreliable. By the reign of the Qing Emperor, who inherited the throne in 1796, the structural strains that Qianlong's magnificence had concealed were becoming impossible to ignore. The British East India Company had been searching for a solution to its trade imbalance with China for decades. Chinese silk, porcelain, and tea flowed westward in enormous quantities. British goods found almost no market in return. The solution the company found was opium, cultivated in Bengal, shipped to Canton, and exchanged for silver that then purchased Chinese exports. By the 1830s, the flow had reversed. Silver was draining out of China. Addiction spread through coastal cities and into the interior. When the Daoguang Emperor appointed Commissioner Lin Zexu to suppress the trade in 1839, Lin confiscated and destroyed over 1,100 tons of British opium at Human. The British response was military. Ironclad steamships, vessels that Chinese coastal batteries could not damage, moved up the Pearl River and then northward along the coast. The First Opium War ended in 1842 with the Treaty of Nanking, Hong Kong ceded, 5 treaty ports opened, and an indemnity of 21 million silver dollars extracted. It was the first of the unequal treaties, and it established a template that other powers would follow. The Taiping Rebellion, which erupted in 1850, struck from within. Hong Xiuquan, a failed examination candidate from Guangdong, experienced visions that led him to believe he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. His Taiping Heavenly Kingdom captured Nanjing in 1853 and held it for 11 years. The armies that fought across southern and central China, Taiping forces against Qing imperial troops, supplemented eventually by foreign officered units, consumed an estimated 20 to 30 million lives. Entire provinces were depopulated. The Yangtze Valley, once the agricultural heart of the empire, was reduced to ash and silence across vast stretches. While the Taiping War still burned, the Second Opium War opened in 1856. Anglo-French forces captured Canton, then moved north. In October 1860, they reached Beijing. The Ming Yuan, the summer palace that Qianlong had filled with European fountains and Chinese pavilions, was looted and burned over 3 days. Its ruins remain visible today, broken marble columns rising from overgrown gardens, a deliberate preservation of the wound. The Empress Dowager Cixi, who came to dominate Qing politics after 1861, understood that the empire required transformation. Railway lines were built. A modern navy was assembled, then destroyed by Japan in the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895, which stripped China of Taiwan and exposed the limits of surface modernization. The Boxer Rebellion of 1900 brought 8 foreign armies into Beijing itself. The indemnity imposed afterward, 450 million tiles of silver, was calculated to equal 1 toll for every person in China. constitutional reform came too late. On February 12, 1912, in a document read aloud in the Hall of Supreme Harmony, 6-year-old Emperor Puyi abdicated. The vermilion walls of the Forbidden City still stood. The dragon throne still gleamed in the winter light. But the mandate, that ancient invisible authority that dynasties had claimed and lost across 3,000 years, had finally, irrevocably, passed from imperial hands into a world the old vocabulary could no longer name. The mandate had passed, but the civilization endured. What followed 1912 was not an ending but a violent, painful transformation, as China searched for a new vocabulary to describe an ancient identity. The Republic of China, proclaimed under Sun Yat-sen, fractured almost immediately into competing warlord territories. Northern China splintered into fiefdoms controlled by military commanders who taxed, conscripted, and fought across landscapes that had once been unified under imperial administration. The Japanese invasion of 1937 brought devastation of a different order. Cities burned, populations displaced, the ancient capital of Nanjing consumed by atrocity in the winter of that year. Tens of millions perished before Japan's surrender in 1945. Civil war followed without pause. On October 1, 1949, standing above Tiananmen, the Gate of Heavenly Peace, built by Ming emperors in 1420, Mao Zedong proclaimed the People's Republic of China. The gate's vermilion walls, the same walls that had framed imperial processions for 5 centuries, now framed a revolution that claimed to have broken with everything those walls represented. Yet, the language of unity, of centralized authority, of civilizational continuity persisted beneath the new vocabulary. China's GDP stood at roughly $59 billion in 1960. By 2023, it exceeded $17 trillion. The speed of that transformation has no precise parallel in recorded economic history. Cities that were market towns in 1980 became metropolises of 10 million within a single generation. The ancient canal and road logic that had always connected China's regions now expressed itself in high-speed rail networks spanning 40,000 kilometers, the longest in the world. Yet, beneath the steel and glass, older patterns remain visible. The Gaokao, China's national university entrance examination, descends in direct philosophical lineage from the imperial examination system that Confucian scholars designed over 2,000 years ago. The principle is unchanged. Merit, demonstrated through rigorous written examination, determines advancement. Families sacrifice across generations for a child's performance on a single test, as they did in the Shang Dynasty, as they did in the Ming. Confucian values, filial respect, collective obligation, the moral weight of education, persist not as museum artifacts, but as living behavioral frameworks within Chinese families across the mainland, Taiwan, Singapore, and diaspora communities from San Francisco to Kuala Lumpur. The civilization traveled with its people, embedding itself in the rhythms of households 10,000 kilometers from the Yellow River. The 4 great inventions, paper, printing, the compass, gunpowder, did not merely change China. They restructured the trajectory of global civilization. European printing presses, oceanic navigation, and gunpowder warfare, all built upon Chinese foundations transmitted through the Islamic world and the Silk Road networks. The world that emerged from the Renaissance, the age of exploration, and the military revolutions of early modernity was, in ways rarely acknowledged, partially constructed from Chinese ingenuity. The Chinese writing system, used continuously for 3,400 years, remains the world's longest-lived script. The same characters that Shang diviners carved into oracle bones at Anyang appear, transformed but recognizable, on smartphone screens in Shanghai today. No other writing system on Earth carries that unbroken thread. What the series has traced across 10,000 years is not merely a sequence of dynasties and battles. It is the story of a civilization that absorbed conquest, survived fragmentation, reinvented its institutions, and persisted, not through rigidity, but through a remarkable capacity to transform while retaining the essential patterns of its identity. The dragon of Chinese legend does not merely endure, it adapts, submerges, and rises again. The Forbidden City still stands at the center of Beijing, its golden roof tiles catching the same northern light they have caught since 1420. Around it, the modern city extends in every direction: towers, highways, digital infrastructure. Yet the axis of the ancient capital remains intact, running north to south through Tiananmen, through the palace, through the landscape itself. The old order and the new exist not in opposition, but in layered continuity, each generation adding its stratum to a civilization that began beside a flooding river with painted pottery and bone flutes, and has not yet finished becoming what it will be. If this journey through 10,000 years of Chinese civilization has moved or intrigued you, consider subscribing to follow future documentary series. There are many more civilizations waiting to be explored, and every one of them has a story this world deserves to hear.